Finally, the week everybody's been waiting for, we're finally at Sebring. So this week's lap guide is of course going to be around Sebring International. So some points to talk about starting out. Patience on rotations, definitely going to be very important here. The track is definitely very flat. There's no camber on any of the apexes or anything like that. So everything as far as car control here goes is going to be focused on mechanical grip and your actual inputs. The track will not do you any favors. The other thing to note too, like everyone always says, respect the bumps. Sunset and turn one are definitely going to be some talking points there. Now that iRacing has 3D curbing implemented for Sebring as well, that's going to add another talking point, especially once we get into Sector 5. But other than that, we'll get right into it. So coming down our start-finish straight, lining up for T1, we're going to follow our K barrier or our wall here against pit lane. Now we want to stay to the right-hand side, and we can see our wall is straight and then bends to the left ever so slightly. Now as we're coming up to this, that will be our braking marker. So to back up a little bit here. So we're probably about 2 to 3 car lengths before that kink in the wall itself, before I start to get on the brakes. It's going to be a little bit tricky to find a visual marker here, but if we start to brake right at the kink, that will be too late. You're going to carry a little too much speed on entry and start to understeer off to the right-hand side. So it's better to be early and lighter on the brake pressure than it will be to be later and harder. Now coming in, we want to turn pretty early. We're going to carry quite a bit of trail brake pressure into the corner. We want to hug right up against our apex wall here, and we see this orange cone on the fence line. That is your apex reference. So this wall goes on forever. Once we get to this cone itself, you can start to reapply the throttle. That should give you a pretty good marker before you start to track out. So if you find that you're picking the throttle up too soon and you're going off into the grass on exit, keep an eye out for this cone. Now the other thing to note on this, you do have to have a particular graphics setting turned on in order to see it. Sebring's not too heavy on graphics, so it shouldn't be an issue to get that turned on. Coming into our next left-hander, we're going to brake just at the 3 cone. You can brake a little bit later, but it makes your turn in that much more difficult. We're going to go from 5th down to 3rd. You might feel like you want to take this in 2nd gear because it is a slow corner. 2nd is going to overslow the car. So staying in 3rd and then getting an early throttle application is going to be key. So we're going to get a late apex, and it'll be a little bit difficult to see here, but for this apex curbing, it's bending to the left and then straightens out just at the end. That's where we want to get the car's maximum rotation to happen. So once we touch this point, we can straighten the wheel out. Now ideally we want to make this whole section as straight as possible, so we're going to drive on the curb here, get the car straightened out, drive on the curb on our right hand side, and this is going to help open up the left-hander into the straight. We're going to stay in 3rd gear here as well, because once again the track is flat. We don't have a whole lot of grip to work with. 2nd gear is going to overslow the car. 3rd gear is going to be easier to get the power down early, and then we can just drive right out of the corner. We can also use this curbing on the exit to help grip up the car and keep it from going into the dirt here. So you can drive on this or right into it, and it should help you keep on track. Moving on to the hairpin. So in the GT3 cars, you can brake pretty late. I'm sure that's what most people are familiar with driving around here. Now in the GT4s, we need to brake pretty early. It's going to be right at the 4 cones. The other thing to note, more than likely during your guys' races, these cones are going to get obliterated and shot off into the distance, so you might use this white line as a better reference, or at least a more consistent one. We're going to downshift all the way into 2nd gear here, and we want to be really patient for rotation. not only is it a little bit of a later exit, or a later apex, excuse me, it's more about the car angle. So if we back up here, we are apexing at about the middle of the corner, but we have the car pointed towards the Chevrolet sign in the distance. So if you're pointed more like the Mobil 1 or the Rolex sign, you'll need to wait a little bit longer before you start to get on throttle. That just means that the car hasn't rotated enough. Now, where this comes into play, if we don't get enough rotation, we can get too far out to the left side here. The car can drive across the dirt, which is totally fine, but you will take an incident point. So if we wait until we see that Chevrolet sign, or at least having the car pointed towards it, that's a good indication you can get back on throttle, still make it on exit, and get away with dipping one tire in the dirt instead of the entire car. Now, of course, this section is going to be flat out. You might be a little bit of door banging through here, and people deciding which lane they want to take coming into this braking zone. So be cautious and have your situational awareness high here. Coming into our next braking zone, we're going to skip the 4 cone. We're going to brake right before the 3. Once again, these cones will probably get obliterated, so focus on that white line if they're missing. We're going to downshift into second gear here as well. We want to get, once again, a little bit of a late apex here on the throttle super early, because the GT4s can be flat out on exit through this section. Now coming into this next corner, this is a really tricky complex. We want to get the car started to slow down between our 3 and our 2 cone. If these cones disappear, unfortunately, we don't have much of a reference visually to go off of. We do have the drainage system over here to the left-hand side that you can somewhat use. It's going to be a little bit hard to see when we're in the cockpit view. So if we back up here, so we can just barely see it, but you do have to take your eyes off the road in order to find it. Something that, again, can be used though. So what's important here is to get the car slowed and rotated before the corner. It's almost like it has 2 angles in this corner itself, so we want to get slowed on the curb, get the car turned in and rotated. We're going to stay in 3rd gear here. Now there is a pretty nasty bump on entry, so you want to get the timing of that bump just right. Once the car settles over that bump, we can get back on throttle at 100% on exit. If you're finding that you're going off into the dirt here, you're not getting enough rotation before apex. So get the car slowed down a little bit sooner, or make sure that you're getting just that extra bit of steering angle coming into the corner. Now coming into our double left apex here, we want to use this curbing on the right hand side as kind of a checkpoint, or I like to think of it as a runway, since we are on a runway. If we get our right side tires on here, that's going to line us up to sweep through this double apex really nicely. If you're on the left-hand side, sometimes you can get a little crowded and you have to use a lot of steering angle to make it through the second left-hander. Now we're going to use the 3 cones as our braking marker here. We want to make sure we're downshifting from 5th to 3rd before we start to turn in. We want to get a little bit of a late apex. Now talking about those 3D curbs again, before those got implemented, you could drive your right side tires across the curbs and even on the concrete patch to the right hand side of it. With them being 3D, it makes it much more difficult. It's still doable, but the car definitely wants to bounce around quite a bit, especially on the fixed setup. So give it a try, but getting your tires right on the line or just hanging over the edge of our curbing is probably going to be the easiest. Now I didn't set that corner up quite as well as I could have. I get that direction change. I start to turn left just a little too late. So keep in mind we want to follow this curbing arc. So if you're falling behind, where that issue is happening is getting on throttle too soon, exiting this right-hander. So a little bit of patience is definitely needed here. We can dip all the way out to the left-hand side to open up the corner. There's no incident limit there. And I also do miss the apex on this corner, not one of my better showings. But once again, with the 3D curbing, we can get right on top of this. You can drive your right side tires on the concrete patch, but something to keep in mind, if we bounce off and then immediately back on, it is jumping the car quite a bit for me. So if you are going to drive all the way out here, make sure that there's time for the car to settle when it comes off of the curbing before it hits coming back up on top of it. We want to get an early power, early throttle application onto this front straight. Of course, like with any straight, the earlier or the sooner you get on throttle, the better run you're going to have down. Now coming into the last two corners, this is a pretty tricky situation, especially for cars with low aero. Now I like to think of our cones here as lanes. So these aren't really used as braking references or brake markers here. Generally speaking, you don't start to brake until you turn in. So I like to consider these as lanes. We can ignore the first four cones here. This will be one lane, and that line would be from these three cones all the way to the inside of our wall on the right hand side. Our second set of cones will be somewhat of a middle of the road line. This is the one that I like to use, it's most consistent. And then lastly, that single cone would be a complete outside lane. Now, where this comes into play is if you're 2-3 cars wide coming into this corner, which is absolutely possible. So we want to use these cones as references for those lanes for how many cars are on our inside or outside. So for example, if we have a car on our outside here, we can take the middle lane or our inside lane here, and then of course vice versa. We want to get the car turned in, straighten the wheel out, and then start to brake and downshift. This corner is going to require quite a bit of trail braking. It's very, very bumpy, and especially in the Porsche with its understeer, we want to make sure that we're keeping all the weight on the front side of the car to keep that turn in going. This will be a little bit of a double apex here as well. It's not entirely important to hit them as apexes, but we want to treat it like that. We'll hold that same steering angle throughout the corner. And then on exit, we can drive all the way out to the left-hand side against the wall. Something to be careful of, this tire barrier will grab your fenders and spin you into the pit lane wall or into other cars. So be cautious of that. Give yourself at least a couple feet of distance to try and avoid anything like that from happening. And other than that, that's going to be our lap guide for our GT4s around Sebring. Races should be very, very good here this week. So once again, just be patient with that rotation, be patient through the bumps, let the car settle before you start to get back on power or add any other inputs. Other than that, I wish you guys the best of luck in officials.